All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development, or AWD1111 Database-Driven Web Development course, I've been creating a series of video presentations based on the PDFs from Mr. Flavio Copes in his Valley of Code website. So far I've gone through the HTML handbook, which is about 75 pages long, and I did 5 different videos. Now, the next one, the CSS handbook, is about 175 pages long, and so far I've done 6 videos, this being number 7. When I get done, I'm going to go through his 56, I think it is, page JavaScript handbook and probably have X number of videos on that. This is all this is all client-side JavaScript stuff. Then we're going to jump into the server side, and we'll go through his Node.js handbook, his React handbook, and some other goodies, so to speak. So I left off last time as we were starting to go into CSS Grid. Now I've got to give, there's a saying, give the devil his due, and this person is not a devil, but I talked about Wes Bose before, and the guy is really incredible. He's got a ton of stuff out there on the system. Now I want to show you his courses. Many of them say premium, which means you have to pay for them. All right, but you'll notice he's also got some, you got to work your way through here. So notice here's a free 30-day vanilla JavaScript coding challenge, free. The CSS Grid, which we're going to look at right now, free. The Flexbox, which we'll look at in just a little bit, free. And I'm just going over the ones that you probably care the most about. This Redux, which is basically, I'm going to be looking at that myself later, but it's, for lack of better words, it's sort of an add-on to React. There's also stuff in Markdown, and there's other stuff in here. All right? But what we're going to cover right now, and what I want you to do, is eventually I want you to go out to the CSS Grid course that Wes Bose has out on cssgrid.io. Sign up by giving your email address, and then you'll get access to all the lessons. That's him right there. You can listen if you want to. He's pleasant enough sounding. As he says, there's no catch. All right, he talks a little bit about himself there, and you'll notice 4 hours, 25 videos. So you're like, well, I can't do all that in one day. I'm going to give you time to sit and look at these. All right. And then I'm going to give you time to sign up for the Flexbox. And you'll notice in here, there's the videos in there. And he doesn't say how long this one is. You are not going to become an expert, but this is some of the better. I've gone through both of these. It's a good course, and it goes through a lot. All right. Now, with that said, let's jump back into our text and start talking about CSS Grid. So you see there it says CSS Grid is the new kid in town, and it's not fully supported by all browsers. Well, let's look. We've done this before where we went out to caniuse.com, and we'll put in here CSS Grid. And you'll notice that, again, some older versions of some browsers are not supporting it, but virtually everything that is fairly new is. You'll notice, too, it looks like it has limited support, partial support, in versions 10 and 11 of IE. But once you move over to Edge and you get past version 16, it's got full support. It's got full support in Chrome. All right, it's got full support in Firefox, etc. All right. Now it says it's a fundamentally new approach to building layouts with CSS. Why? Because it gets rid of the idea of using floats. All right. It says at the time of this writing, which is about 2 years ago, all major browsers already support the technology. It says covering 92% of all users. Now, this is an important point. CSS Grid is not competition to Flexbox. They can operate together you can use one within the other. Now, the reason that this is important is, as it says here, building layouts for the web has traditionally been fairly complex, especially if you want to set things up where you've got a little bit of creativity, where your columns are different widths and different heights, etc. All right. So it says nowadays you have two very powerful and well-supported tools at your disposal. CSS Flexbox, which we talk about next, and CSS Grid, which we will talk about now. It says these two are the tools for building web layouts for the future. It says unless you are using older browsers, there's really no reason to play with any of this stuff anymore. All right. In this guide, the author says there's all you need to know about going from zero knowledge to being a proficient user. Notice, not an expert. All right. And you can find a lot of stuff out there on the web. So if I say in here, W3 Schools, CSS Grid, it's going to come up with something, CSS Grid Layout Module. There it is. All right. And they go through how you can set this stuff up. This working, in my opinion at least, working with Grid and working with Flexbox, all right, it's not something you typically are going to memorize all of it, but part of being a good developer is knowing where to go to look for something. All right. So as it says here, the grid layout is activated by setting display to grid. All right. And when we get to Flexbox, we'll do a display flex. As with Flexbox, you can define some properties on the container and some properties on the individual items that are on the grid. The properties together determine the final look on the grid. The most common container properties are grid template columns and grid template rows. As you would guess, the grid template columns define the number of rows, or columns rather, in a grid. The grid template rows, the number of rows in the grid. Okay. So they mention here the following snippet defines a grid that has 4 columns. Each column is 200 pixels wide, and each column has a row in it with a height of 300. So again, you need the display grid when you start, then you set up the columns, and then you set up the rows. And you get something that looks like this. Here's another example that we've set up that's got 2 columns and 2 rows. And you can see the different look and feel for it. All right. All right. So the author mentions here, many times you might have a fixed header size, a fixed footer size, and a flexible main content. In this case, as mentioned here, you can use the auto keyword. Okay. So this would be a 100 pixel header, a 100 pixel footer, and then what's left is going to be for your content. Okay. In the above examples, the author says here, we made regular grids by using the same values for rows and columns, but you can specify any value for each row to create a lot of different visual designs. So you can see here's an example. And another example. Now you might look at something like this and go, who'd ever want to do this? Well, again, in the past, and you still see this in some sites, rather than having your header up on the top here like this, the header was basically on the side. All right, so you can set this up, as said, virtually any way you want to or need to have it set up. I have mentioned in class before, some of you may have heard this, some of you may not have, but I mean, I have worked for people in the past where, you know, you kind of ask yourself, why would you want this? You know, this is going to be a butt ugly looking interface, but if that's what they want, that's what you give them. Unless you specify it, notice that by default, there's no space between cells, sometimes called the gutter area. You can add spacing by using grid column gap and grid row gap, or the shorthand where you can set them both. So notice here's the gap here, and there's the gap there. So we said grid column and row gap are both 25 pixels. by no means do they have to be the same value. Here it is with the shorthand because it's the same number for both. All right. Spawning items on multiple columns or multiple rows. If we look at this, you can see where you start to get some very different looking effects there. So it says every cell item has the option to occupy more than just one box in a row and expand horizontally or vertically as needed. All right, it says the properties you will use for that are grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end. So they're adding the stuff in here for the different items. So you'll notice there's item 1 and there's item 6. So we're having them break the mold, so to speak, from what we have up here. And when you look, all right, there's item 1 and there's item 6. So as it says, the numbers correspond to the vertical line that separates each column starting from 1. It takes a while to wrap your head around what is going on in here. Again, that's why it is really, really important that you go through this Wes Bose thing. Why? Because virtually every website that you create today, all right, you want it to be responsive, but you can achieve a lot of your responsive website design without having to use floats anymore by using Flexbox and CSS Grid. All right. Specifying the exact width of each row and column is not ideal in every case, so you can use what are called fracs or fractions, which are a unit of space. So notice it says the following example divides a grid into 3 columns with the same width, 1/3 each. So 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. Had we made this, for example, just as an example, 1 FR, 2 FR, 3 FR, that would have divided it into sixths, where 1/6, 2/6, and 3/6 would have been used. All right. As mentioned here, you can also use percentages, and you can mix and match fractions, pixels, rems, and percentages. So you can get some very different looking effects by using this stuff. There's also repeat, all right? So notice here repeat, rather than having to list something out 4 times with a size, so it'll create 4 columns, each of this width. You can use repeat with columns, all right, and put a number in there, or you can use repeat, rather than a size, you can put fraction in there. You can specify minimum widths for a row, all right, so you've got a min-max type of thing here. And you can specify a maximum value. So the minimum and maximum values. Or as it says, just set a minimum and the rest will be taken up, all right, by what's left. So that'll be the minimum. That's as small as it can get. All right. Positioning elements using grid template areas. As mentioned here, by default, elements are positioned in a grid given their order in the HTML structure, but you don't have to do that. You can use grid template areas to move things around on a grid, as it says, to spawn an item on multiple rows or columns instead of using grid column. So they give an example here. I'm not going to put that in, but when you look at it, I thought they would run it here, but I guess they didn't. All right. Some of this stuff, it's almost as though you're using a table and you are using col span or row span. The idea is similar in nature. All right. You can set an empty cell using a dot instead of an area name. They've done that there. You can make a grid extend to fill an entire page using FR. All right, so notice here we've got the heights set to 100% of the view height. And they end this section with an example here. So you'll notice what they have, a header that basically takes up 100% and a certain width at the top. All right, it's 100% width and a certain height. Same thing with the footer. Then they've got a sidebar that's taking up X amount of room and the main content. You'll notice that there is a gutter or basically there is a grid gap between the header, sidebar, and main content, between the sidebar and main content, and between the sidebar and main content and the footer. So it says here is a simple example of using CSS Grid to create a site layout that provides what I just mentioned to you. There's the markup. Now, it's not the CSS. So if you put something like this in here, let's see if we can achieve this. So I'm going to grab this. So let me grab everything that's in here. Okay? Just like that. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. We've still got another page in here. Not there. We've got another page in here that we haven't used yet, right? Our contact page. All right, so that's all that's in there right now. And let's add this. Okay, what did that do? It's easiest to show you. All right, so let's go and bring this up with Live Server. This is the contact page. Welcome. There's a header. There's hi. And you'll notice that stuff is kind of just thrown all over the place. All right. So that was the first thing that they added in here. Then they add the CSS. So you'll notice the grid area header, grid area content, grid area sidebar, grid area footer, not grid area, but footer, or grid area footer. And here's the wrapper. So let's grab this. I want to make sure I don't screw up anything that's in that I'm using right now for the regular website. So I'm going to grab all this. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, and then I'm going to come in here and I am going to go in and under CSS here, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it CSSGrid.css. And I'm going to paste all of that in. All right, this is just pasted right from what's in there. Now I'm going to pretty it up just a real little bit here, just putting in a couple line breaks. All right, and that's all I've done. Now I have to go back into my contact file here, and I've added this external spreadsheet, but I'm going to add the other one. So in here, I'm also going to add CSSGrid.css. Now when I come back into here, take a look at how that's changed. All right, and let's look at what happens as far as trying to make it responsive. All right, now I'm not saying this is responsive, but I'm saying it is set up to be responsive. We will have to combine probably some media queries with this, but you can see, at least on the way that it's set up typically, this is pretty much is achieving exactly what we wanted. So as the author says here, basically it assigns every different tag to a grid area name used in the grid template areas property in the wrapper. When the layout is smaller, we can put the sidebar below using the content of a media query. So that's what they're doing. So let's add that. Now he's got it in there as a code pen, but I think it's a good idea to at least take a look at this ourselves. So I'm going to come into here. Here's our CSS grid. When you use media queries, remember they typically go down at the bottom like this. All right. So I've saved. Let's go back to here. Now let's try to make this responsive and see what it looks like. Now, we haven't done anything to try to make this more responsive. You know, we could have shrunk the size or done something else. It's okay the way it is for what we're doing now, but you see the rest of it now not only is responsive, but it looks pretty decent. And as you start to stretch it out, when you reach a certain point, boom, now it goes back to 2. We might have to do some work on this yet. All right. But when we're at this point, notice what's happening. We've got this all in here. The sidebar is a certain size, and the main content is trying to take up the rest of the area, the header and the footer are taking up as much area as we have available. All right. Now that pretty much, I think at least, should be it for this. It says these are the basics of CSS Grid. There are many things that were not included, but the author tried to make it simple. Before we go on to Flexbox, I want to just go, because I do this a lot myself, and I'm just going to go into Google and I'm going to say CSS Grid versus Flexbox. What's the difference? Grid is made for two-dimensional layout, while Flexbox is for one-dimensional. This means Flexbox can work on either a row at a time or a column at a time, while CSS Grid can work on both. Flexbox gives you more flexibility when working on either a row or a column individually. All right, and this is out of Geeks for Geeks, but you can find this kind of stuff any place. So in other words, Grid allows you to work in a multi-dimensional way, whereas Flexbox will only allow you to work in a single dimension type of way. All right. So again, I am going to ask that you go through this CSS Grid that's in here. All right. And you will have an assignment where you use Grid and or you use Flexbox. So we're going to come back in just a minute and then talk about Flexbox. All right. So let me jump back to here and we'll see you in that in just a couple minutes.